Welcome to the Worldbuilding Workshop, the companion podcast to the book of the same name. My name is Stephen Slota, and here with me is my co-author, my co-host, a man once described by New York Times columnist Ezra Klein as 7 Fruit Loops short of a box.
I missed that. Trent Hergenrader, the one and only.
The one and only. Is there another Dr. Hergenrader out there, or are you the only one?
There is. There's a guy who studies fish in Nebraska.
There is a Stephen Slota who, last I checked, is at UC Irvine and has a PhD in molecular biology, which is really funny because my undergrad was in molecular biology.
Oh, look at that. Maybe it was a
small world.
Yeah, maybe it's a twin. I'm glad to hear that those people with our names are getting the success that they so richly deserve.
I was going to say,
while we labor,
we're the evil twins who didn't get the success.
Exactly.
They're the good ones who did.
Right. That explains
qualifying that by saying I know nothing about them, but I'm going to assume that's the case.
Right.
Okay. Thank you all for joining for the third in our 3-episode series where we've worked together, Trent and I, to create a brand spanking new story world using the collaborative world building methodology that we outlined in the text. Parts 1 and 2 featured an animated conversation about our world's 14 substructural categories. We talked about how its governmental, economic, social, and cultural systems interact with one another. And we talked about the scope, the sequence, the breadth, the depth, the genre elements, all those things that we thought would provide a maximally delectable world-building flavor profile. And now, in part 3, we're ready to finally apply Trent's character building system to develop a diverse panoply of citizens to breathe life into our big ideas about the world's social forces. As a quick review, we ended our last episode after defining several of the world's key characteristics, and there are a few we probably still need to round out, but in general, what we came up with was a dark fantasy world mixed with Western genre elements. We called this our horror boomtown, a gothic horror, dark fantasy, Western mixture or synthesis. The community had a sense of shared purpose. It was a small exploration party that was given orders to extract some rare resource from this location, but the scouting report that they received was incorrect or incomplete. And this sociocultural and sociopolitical rupture starts to manifest through the discovery of some poorly understood artifact. We said that it was going to be located in the bottom of a cave on an island in the middle of this difficult-to-cross lake. And the environment of this horror boomtown is a gloomy, rocky, difficult terrain, harsh weather climate, damp, cool, and uncomfortable place. We decided the aesthetics would be a 19th century Gothic influence, something like Frankenstein, Vazen, Edgar Allan Poe, Tim Burton, that sort of thing. And the town itself is cramped and claustrophobic. The architecture is damp stone and wood. The buildings are probably a little bit decayed because of the weather conditions, and the wildlife is scarce. We're not looking at a lot of diversity of flora and fauna here. The scope was pretty narrow. We decided on a community of about 1,000 people. It's pretty close-knit. Everybody's up in everybody else's business because it's roughly the size of maybe a medium-sized high school. And the town has been established for quite some time, at least several months, maybe longer, but it's isolated from other regions. And we compared traversing to this place like crossing the Oregon Trail to get from the eastern part of the United States out west. Similar idea here, although we hadn't decided on a cardinal direction. I guess it doesn't really even matter. The world is sort of just isolated from everywhere else. And then finally, and most importantly, the population very recently discovered some artifact that, to our knowledge as the creators, has no real inherent power, but the possibility that it could have some kind of power ultimately drives the townspeople crazy, for lack of a better word. They give into their worst impulses and become maximally themselves, the people they were always meant to be. They start throwing the rest of the commune under the bus because of these dramatic changes in their character. And we think about it as being a theme of humans being their own worst enemies. Trent actually, at the end of the last episode, compared this to using social media, which I think is probably an apt comparison. Now, before we dive into the creation of the characters themselves, I was going to ask Trent, yes. I don't have any knowledge of how this character building system works, apart from a little bit of discussion you and I have had over the years about what this could or should look like, how you might implement it in a classroom. So I'm going to be learning authentically with the audience about this. I wanted to know, like, first, can you give an explainer on what this process is? And then, second to that, and maybe most interesting to me as somebody who's thinking a lot about education and learning theory, instructional design, I'm curious how you think about this producing a cross section of the population to kind of go into deeper analysis or think about themes or, sort of those meta level reflections that a student might do if they were doing this as part of a class. So that's my foundation. Let's give us a little bit of juice here.
Absolutely. So, thinking back to the world building card deck, there are the 4 structures with the 14 substructures. Every substructure has its own card, and then they get a card that is 1 to 5. This is what we did last time, 2 times ago, I think, and then talk through it. And the idea being that between the high values and the low values and the values that are trending, either up or down, getting stronger or weaker in the world, naturally you can start to say, okay, I'm going to find some tensions here. Some people are going to want these things to increase or decrease or whatever. And the character building deck is very similar and it works with the world building deck. You can use it completely separately or you can use it with it. This is part of a 3-part thing that I'm working on. I need to get the rules written up so I can submit it for possible publication. But it's the world building deck, character building deck, and then a story building deck in which you take those characters and then you get a bunch of cards and you have to tell us a 5-scene, 3-act story. For just to stick with the character cards right now, I think there's like 16 or 20, something like that. So they all start off with an archetype and they're like Jungian archetypes, right? So it's not necessarily a job career, but it is something so that like you could have like the Joker or the Jester or something like that, or the Guardian. And you would think, okay, well, someone who is a Guardian as an archetype quite possibly could be, a police officer or a member of the military or something like that, but it just needs to be their personality. It could be a kindergarten teacher too, right? Somebody like that. And then they each get so we've got all these, half of a poker card sized cards that are broken up into these different categories. And everyone gets a positive trait, a negative trait, something that connects them to the world, a motivation, and then they get a connection to the other 2 characters, right? So actually, when I do this, I lay out 3 in a row, and the one in the middle has a connection to the characters on either side of them, but characters on the outside don't have a relationship that is defined by the cards. That's something that you can decide. Maybe they know each other, maybe they don't. Just adds a little bit more flexibility. And the thing, too, that I think, coming back to talking about the world building deck and this card building deck, or this character building deck, these have gone through quite a bit of playtesting over the years. The story building deck that I'm working on still needs some work, which is why it's sort of been dragging. But this is pretty fine-tuned in terms of how it works. I try to get it so there aren't any. You can't have a character whose good attribute is brave and their bad attribute is cowardly, right? So trying to get rid of all of the things that would cause conflict within those characters. But the whole idea is, I was just going through this, so it's fresh in my mind. Just going through this with my world building class the other day, is that stories are usually about conflict, and it doesn't need to necessarily be a huge world-changing conflict. It could be a conflict between 2 different characters. It could be a conflict between a character and the world in which they're trying to change one of those trending values, either stop it from trending or speed it up or something like that. And it can also be that, someone is out to get them, in which they're just minding their own business and someone decides to come after them, or, the world has decided that they're a problem and now, they're not, they're going to be hunted down or something like that, or your political party that you were a part of is no longer in power and now they're doing a purge, right? So there's got to be some sort of tension either between characters or between characters in the world, or in, lots of really good stories, there's connections between both, right? There are the connections, the tensions between the characters and the tensions between the characters in the world. So looking at something like Last of Us, right, would be an example of where the world is dangerous, full of zombies, right? Various factions that you may or may not get along with depending on who you are. And then the 2 people who are Joel and Ellie, who are the 2 main characters, then also don't always get along and agree on what they ought to be doing, right? So then that gives you plenty of good storytelling material, like basically just causing problems for characters and then saying, how would they choose to deal with this problem or try and overcome the situation? That's what makes plot, right? I always say, I call it throwing sparks. You want some tension, you want some conflict to throw throw some sparks, and then those sparks are where the story genesis lives. And it's a way of getting them to think through. I mean, the way that we do this after we build the catalog, which we didn't do for this project because it doesn't really fit into this format. But normally they would all create a number of characters, a number of places, a number of items, right, to try and build out a very big library. Normally, I'll have students doing 10 entries each, and in this case, we're just kind of skipping past that, which is totally fine. But sometimes it's about trying to figure out who in this world actually has the most interesting story, and oftentimes people will find out that, oh, I really wanted to tell a story about a guy who was going to do this, and then through the world building and character development process, through using these cards, it's like, ooh, who would have a much more interesting story is this woman, right? Like she would have a lot more interesting things going on in her life just based on who she is, right? So if you're a pacifist in a super warlike country, then or a super warlike society, well, then you've got those problems, right? Like you're trying to be a pacifist where the culture is, much more about war, things like that. And those are the kind of things too in which it's less about coming up with great ideas and more about interpreting what are the possibilities within the cards and coming up with lots and lots of possibilities and then settling on the ones that you like the most or feel the best to you, as opposed to just coming up with an idea and then saying, I got to ram this home. This is my one story. And it's like, yeah, you should be. I was just saying this. We were doing what I call rapid story prototyping, where I had students doing basically the same thing that we've been doing, where build a world real fast, build 3 characters real fast, and then build a story real fast. And I said, once you get good at this, you should be able to do 2 or 3 story drafts in an hour, right? You should be able to rip through them and see different story options. And maybe 2 of those stories won't be any good, but who cares, right? It's like storytelling is the structures of them. That's all very cheap and easy to do once you start putting in time, especially if you're creating something in media. That's a much bigger investment of both your time and often money and things like that. So why would you go with the first thing that comes to mind when you should mine around a little bit and figure out what is sort of the most interesting part? So that's what I would say, is throwing that out there, and then we'll see in just a second here, what are the interesting connections between the characters, and then what are the interesting connections between each character in the world, and then where do we see the sources of tension in this specific world where society is already starting to come apart at the seams a little bit and people are already kind of at each other's throats.
I don't remember if I had mentioned this or you had mentioned this in a previous episode. There's enough of them now where I've started to forget what we actually talked about, but one of the things that I've kept with me that you gave me when I was starting to teach my interactive storytelling class was that it's a very simple equation of character plus setting equals plot. You just find these people, figure out what's going on in their lives, and then allow the environment to shape their behavior. And then the plot emerges from that behavior that is being exhibited by those characters. I like this premise a lot because it reminds me a little bit of Fiasco, the game Fiasco, which is all about creating connections between the various characters, the objects that are involved that they care about, and then watching the whole system sort of collapse in on itself in sort of this humorous, ridiculous way. But it's almost as if you took Fiasco, put it inside a snow globe of the environment we created last time, and just shake it around and see what happens. And so the notion that you have a central character who has relationships to these other characters who don't have relationships to each other necessarily, or they're at least not well defined, just creates a lot of opportunity for imagination to be applied here. And I know we haven't really gotten to the interactions between individual people and this environment we've created, but what I'm most interested in, at least when we get to the other side, is what can you do with these characters once they exist that's not only about generating a plot, but generating a plot with a purpose. Like it can teach you something about the world, about the social forces embedded in it, about how different kinds of people are perceiving and acting on those social forces, or at least trying to move the world around them to comport with how they imagine that world should be. Because we spend so much time talking about not just empathy and critical thinking, but actionability. And if we want learners to think about what their role in society is, if they're to drill down and decide, this is the person I am in this environment, and these are the things, these options that are available to me to change the world in some way, here's how I'm going to move that process forward a little bit by making this specific decision or pulling this specific lever, or, I have this platform, this is how I'm going to apply it to be able to solve some problem down the road. And I think about this a lot as somebody who is now working in industry, and oftentimes there are people who don't think more than a quarter ahead of where they are, which is, from my perspective, not a terribly good way to do things, but trying to communicate to them broadly this is the reason why it really matters that you plan further down the road than where you are. It reminds me of that study that showed that new drivers are more apt to look directly in front of a car when they're driving versus people who've been driving for a very long time who will look several miles down the road if they can.
Hmm.
Because you start to develop familiarity with how it feels to be in a car and your response time gets better. You start to realize that not only can you depend on the immediacy of reacting to something that jumps in front of the car, but also if you're thinking enough moves ahead, you're going to be able to plan for what can you do 3, 4, 5 seconds from now, as opposed to what's going to happen in the next nanosecond
Yeah.
if that deer happens to leap out.
Yep. I was going to say, too, one of the things that I talk about with the character, I've done this before where I've used role-playing game character creation sheets and say, okay, well, we're going to model the characters in this story or, a historical character. One of the ones that I always like to bring up is Martin Luther King Jr., where it's like, okay, so what are his attributes, right? And if you start changing any of those attributes, he stops being the man that he was, right? So it's like if he's a wallflower and is afraid of public speaking, we would never know who Martin Luther King Jr. was, right? But he had that mix. And he also had the opportunity, right? The world was changing at a time, right person at the right time who seizes that opportunity, right? And it's different people are built different ways. And I think that's also something, if you are not somebody who has the ability to stand up and talk in front of a group of people, well, think about what else could you maybe do, right? Like if you're not built like that, that doesn't mean that you can't accomplish other goals other ways. But, that's one of the things that I always talk about with, D&D classes or archetypes in games is, so your group is sneaking up on a tower and there's a guard outside. Do you knock him out? Do you sneak around him? Do you try and bluff, right? Those are three completely different options that you need to think about. Who's good at doing what? What are the ramifications for each of those three things, right? Like, what does it mean if you do this or you do that? And those are all good things that storytellers should be thinking about. But then there are also things that good human beings should be thinking about, right? The ramifications. If we knock this guard out, where are we going to put the body? Where would you stash it? And then what if somebody comes around? Well, if you sneak in, the threat is still there. What if he hears you? If you fast talk him, well, what if he starts to doubt? So there's all sorts of different questions that's what good writers should be thinking about how their characters would actually react, rather than just thinking about what's convenient for the plot, which is something that when they have, I mean, in my experience teaching narrative, narrative structure, narrative design, stuff like that, it's quite often that the first draft of a plot goes without a hitch. It's like, everything happens. It's supposed to happen. They get everything they want. It's like, that's not interesting. That's not fun. You know what I mean? Like and again, I think I think I've said this before, but I think video games, where you're trying to succeed and you're trying to level up, that's the kind of narrative that we often will get in an open world RPG. You get more powerful, you get more influence, you get more skills. And in our lives, it doesn't work quite that easily, right? Like you just can't suddenly say, oh, I'm going to be this. And then you start getting XP and then all of a sudden everybody recognizes that you're that much better or whatever. But anyway, let's we're almost 20 minutes. Let's get going. We're almost 20 minutes in. Let's do it.
I have one last thought I wanted to interject before we do this. Yeah, sorry. You have to bear with me. The takeaway from what you just described is there's a lot of interpretability that goes into this too. And I know when we talked about the world building deck initially, we described you can really use it two ways. One of them is to craft your own story world. The other is to evaluate a world. And as you're describing the archetypes that are baked into these characters, I started synthesizing two things you had said. One of them being, trying to figure out what does it mean to interpret the words of those archetypes in multiple dynamic ways, as well as how do you create interesting people who would react with interesting behaviors or responses to the environment. And I really like the image of the guardian archetype as a kindergarten teacher, like you said, because it draws on that reality of, I mean, honestly, the first thing it made me think of is the teacher's number one duty in a lockdown situation is to protect their students. And like that is a form of guardianship that
absolutely.
we don't actually spend enough time crediting in society. And so to be able to position learners to think through how these different archetypes apply to different kinds of people in different roles, different jobs, different classes, however you want to think about it, it forces them to be creative in a way that I often think they are denied when they're in other courses. Like when they're taking other classes, they're being forced to box everything up neatly in all these categories. And we're asking them to do the exact opposite, which is to blow all those categories up and think multilaterally about not just what a specific job, class, archetype is, but what would different kinds of people, like you said, with different characteristics, how would they interpret those roles and then apply them in some given setting? It just feels really rich. Like there's a lot here to
Well,
kind of
thank you.
deconstruct.
Yeah, I think it works, and this is why I'm excited about getting it out into the world. Sometime whenever probably this summer when I'm going to write all the rules for it. So,
All right, now I have delayed us enough. Let's jump in. Let's have you walk us through
all
what are we
right.
doing to build this first character.
All right, so I've got a stack of cards here that are the archetypes, and then I've got cards for positive trait, negative trait, motivation, and then something that connects them to some part of the world, which will be clear in just a minute. And then there will be two relationships that are built. So we don't decide. I mean, generally, what I do is I don't decide genders or names or ages or anything. I just start with the archetypes and then these main parts of the character, and then start to decide. Because if they're lovers or partners or something like that, right, or parent child, you can decide on the fly whether that's a mother-daughter, mother-son, whatever, siblings or whatever it is. So without further ado, our first archetype is a messenger. A messenger. Our
Interesting.
second archetype is a merchant.
That
I'm writing
seems
these down
fitting.
too, yeah. And then the third is a healer. Right, so this is a case too in which a healer could be someone who is literally like a doctor, or they could just be somebody who is someone who's a comfort to their friends and things around them. All right, so I've got an online version of this for the cards, so I don't have to deal them all out. Okay, so our messenger, the positive trait is charming. Their negative trait is they're grumpy. Their motivation is to gain promotion, and they are very poor. They don't have much money. Our merchant is versatile, is their positive trait. Temperamental is their negative trait. To gain knowledge is their motivation. And they are a vigilante. That is their connection to the world, the thing that they do in the world. And then finally, our healer, their positive trait is they've got social graces. The negative is they are possessive. Their motivation is to find justice in the world. And then they're also an artist. So they enjoy creating art in a world that is sort of artless. The relationship, the messenger and merchant are lovers, and the merchant and healer are a teacher and a student. You got all that?
I think so.
I'll
Just
run.
double checking. The
Yeah.
messenger and the merchant are lovers, you said.
Yes.
And the merchant and healer are teacher
Teacher and
student.
student. Yeah. Right. So this is one of those cases in which, right off the bat, I'll run through them again real quickly. But the merchant, their motivation is to gain knowledge, right? And if they've got a teacher-student relationship, it seems like they'd probably be the student in that situation, right? Like you maybe say that they're the teacher who's like doing research or whatever. So anyway, so what we got here, messenger who is charming, grumpy, wants to gain promotion, and who is poor. We've got a merchant who is versatile, temperamental, they want to gain knowledge, and they are a bit of a vigilante. There is the healer who has great social graces but is possessive. They seek justice, and they are an artist. The messenger and merchant are lovers, and the merchant and healer are teacher and student. So,
I'm thinking about the charming but grumpy messenger is an
right?
interesting combination.
I
I'm
think
trying
that's
to think of a
me, I think.
I was gonna say I wasn't gonna be the one to say that out
And
loud,
poor.
but and poor. Yeah,
And poor.
the charming grumpy messenger who is poor. Yeah,
Yeah.
that makes sense. Sounds like a professor.
Yep.
Now, with respect to these archetypes, we had just talked about them being sort of broadly interpretable. Do you think of the messenger as being a communicator, as in they are delivering a spoken message, like they might be a personality who would perform, or is that a separate archetype? That I know you had mentioned there was something like the jester or the joker.
Yeah, it could be. So it's however we wish to interpret it. Like I tend to think about somebody who is, I mean, they could literally be like a mail carrier or, someone who runs messages or something like that. Or just like the harbinger of change or, whatever it is, like someone who is saying, global warming will kill us all or something like that. So it could be that kind of thing where it's just more generally trying to inform people about things.
We had discussed the premise for this world being that the discovery of this artifact that was difficult to get to. I'm kind of thinking messenger in this context should probably be the person who discovered it, right? That
Okay.
their message is the notion of going back to town and telling them that this thing exists or they had this experience. I see that as aligning with the other characteristics. at least in terms of gaining promotion, would be you'd hope that you could use this information in some way that would raise your station in this society. And if you're very poor, you obviously have a motivation to try and find a way to monetize that. So
Right.
there's a nice synthesis of those qualities. And then charming makes sense because you're theoretically, if you're a messenger, you're probably persuasive or you have some ability to communicate effectively. Grumpy seems to track if you're poor. Like
Yeah, exactly.
being financially not well off implies that you probably have a lot of problems, especially in a society. We had discussed this last time, but the notion of this being communal, that the amount of relative distance between the wealthy and the poor is negligible because everybody kind of is living on the
Right.
same rations or they're living with the same basic community resources available to them. So maybe in this context, the very poor might be that you're just low on the social ladder, the social hierarchy.
Yeah.
And so maybe the richness that would come from persuading other people or telling other people about this discovery would be some sort of social promotion, right? And
Yeah.
when we're talking about gaining promotion, it might not be literal in terms of a job, but it could just be social promotion to be more important to the society as a whole.
Yeah, yeah. That's right. As you were talking too, so I'm thinking, okay, well, looking at both the merchant and the healer, then it seems pretty clear that the messenger. So we've got in our world, to recap, the economic strength is trending up and the wealth distribution is trending down, right? So I can totally see the messenger being like, hey, I just struck oil, right? And it's like it determined, not everybody is going to get equally rich because some people have property with oil on it and some people don't have, like metaphorically. So they're saying, let's cash in to their lover, who is the merchant, who you would think ostensibly would be all about it. But the merchant is, a student of this healer who wants to spread social justice, right? Like, more justice and art and things that are not material wealth. So then I could see how that becomes a big conflict between lovers is like, hey, we just, we got a chance to make something big here. You know what I mean? Like we could really elevate our station. And they're like, oh, I was just donating all of our stuff to charity so we could go, pray in the woods or something like that. Right. So, and it's like, oh, well, babe, why are we doing that? You know what I mean? We got a big chance to score it rich. So yeah, so that was, but what are you thinking? You got other ideas? That was one tension that I could tease out right away.
I think that's very workable. And honestly, if we're interested in sort of where the social dynamics are going to break down between people or become stronger, I guess, between people, I'm kind of imagining that this drives a wedge between the messenger and the merchant, that the messenger really wants to do something with this information. The merchant is opposed to that because of the learning they're doing with this healer, and that the healer, in this context of the world we've created, is probably skeptical of what this discovery could or should mean. And so even if the message is convincing most of the townspeople, the healer might be the one who's saying, this is a problematic situation, and maybe we should be a little bit more incredulous about what's going on here, that there might be an ulterior motive, or it's not what we think it might be, or are we attributing superstition to something that we shouldn't? I think there's a bunch of different ways to interpret that, especially if that's the teacher. That might be somebody who is more knowledgeable and is able to apply those critical faculties to this situation.
Yep.
I think possessive is an interesting characteristic here too, because maybe the healer sees the merchant as being manipulated by the messenger, and is then trying to become more possessive or draw this person more into their life, as recognizing it not necessarily in a objectifying way, but more of a, I care about your well-being and I don't want to see you fall down this rabbit hole with your messenger partner who's going to drag you to whatever the depths of this are, metaphorically or literally. So and these are just three people in the town. We don't even know how the rest of the town might be reacting to all of this. But I could see that as being sort of the focal point. And maybe the messenger is so persuasive, so charming that, and maybe the grumpiness is something that's being offset by the charm, that the town knows this person is typically very dour and unpleasant to be around, but this newfound optimism in them, this newfound there's a twinkle in their eye after discovering this thing, and they're starting to see, oh, this really could change things for us around here. This place has been so dark and miserable and difficult, and if the messenger can be made happy or could be convinced of the goodness of this thing, maybe we all could be. So furthering this metaphor of social media, maybe this is it, is the social media is dragging the town down and only one person recognizes it.
I was going to say, as you were talking, I'm like chuckling to myself because they discovered AI quite obviously. And the messenger is Sam Altman, right? Like saying like, we all need to throw it into everything ASAP, right? And then the healer is the philosophy of technology person saying like maybe we should
Yeah.
be thinking about the social justice aspects of this before we let it out of the before we open Pandora's proverbial box. It's almost too on the nose, but I like it. And I was going to say too, so one of the things that I like to try and isolate in this is who the protagonist is going to be, because this is something that I
Mm,
always, especially in fiction writing, it's like students will choose. I think it's because they're so used to watching TV and watching
yeah.
movies that it's not told through the same perspective as a story usually is. A story is
Hmm.
usually each scene is told from a very specific character's point of view, and then you switch point of views between chapters or between section breaks or whatever. And they
Hmm.
tend, we just went through this in class yesterday, they tend to have kind of a, it's neither but both of their story, right? And that tends, and for fiction writing, that tends not to be a great thing. The protagonist usually, not always, but usually is the person in the middle, the character in the middle, because they have the two connections. But it doesn't need to be. But I could totally see how, coming up with, and I guess this is where we want to get into the sort of the narrative design or narrative structure of this. It's either a 3-act or a 5-act structure in which, what I always try and push them to do, and I'm developing this card game around, is you've got Act 1, Scene 1, and then you've got 3 scenes in Act 2, and then one final scene after the climax. It's Act 3.
Mm,
And in the Act 1, you need to pose in the form of a question: will Frodo destroy the Ring of Power? Right? And then that is the
mm,
question that gets answered at the climax. Yes, he does, even though it's not in a way that we may have expected. But yes, the answer is he does destroy the Ring of Power. And then one of the questions that I follow that up with for the denouement in the last act is, how did they feel about it? Like, to what level did they succeed? And then are they satisfied with that result, right? And it's like in that case, Frodo feels pretty good about having achieved it, but he's also really chewed up and really can't stay in the world all that much longer because he's got so many pains, both physical and psychological, to deal with. So it's like, oh, well,
hmm.
that was sort of a bittersweet victory. It is the classic hero's journey that the hero saves the world, but they are not allowed to enjoy it for whatever
Hmm.
reason. But thinking about this, like I was thinking from a narrative perspective, if I were going to write this story, I think the merchant who's being tugged in both directions is the most interesting one, right? Like that's, and especially if the idea is the obelisk or whatever artifact they find is ramping up their personality types, right? Then
Hmm.
that means that our messenger is super charming, which may mean that they're going to attract new suitors, and
Mm,
also super grumpy and super angry about the situation, right? That the merchant is even dawdling about why aren't they committing so much? And then on the flip side, right, it's like that would be the healer's role would be to like, you can see what this is doing to your lover, right? And it's bad.
hmm.
So don't go into that. Break up with them if you have to, because this is going to be a bad thing.
So when you're going through this process and you're structuring the story, if the students are structuring the story or you're structuring the story, is this the point where you start to introduce specific characteristics to these people? Because the first thing I thought is, oh, well, the messenger, if they're the one who to have discovered this thing, if they're the one whose personality is being at least initially the most amplified by it, should this person be ship going or seafaring in some way? Maybe they're a fisherman who went out into the waters and
Hmm.
found this cave on the island, or do you hold off a little bit longer, or is it just sort of messy and you figure it out?
It's just kind of messy because sometimes things fall into place much later, and this is what I always say too to my students: is this is where revision comes in, right? Like it sometimes takes a second draft for you to be like, oh, I know what. Yeah, now this makes a whole hell of a lot of sense, right? Like
Mhm.
makes even more sense. And then the key is you got to go back and pretend like you always meant that, right? Like, oh, I always had
Mhm.
it in my mind that these two were lovers or whatever it was, right? That's like
Mhm.
I always think about George Lucas going up struggling with the end of Empire Strikes Back and then going up to his hotel room and coming back down and being like, oh, Darth Vader is his dad. And everyone's like, oh, wow, right? It's like he just needed to go upstairs, and like think about it for a little bit, because that's where I think we've talked about this, but George Lucas lies about like everything when it comes to the
Yeah.
history of Star Wars. But that's one in which, you gotta give him the credit. He was the one who came up with that twist, and it totally works. And then it does, and this is where, over the long haul, we all laugh at how, Obi-Wan is lying to Luke throughout Star Wars, right? But still, at the end of the day, that was a fairly late sort of discovery in the story that ended up becoming really powerful. And that's one of those things too, where I'm teaching. Maybe I have this in my brain because I'm teaching my transmedia story worlds in the fall. But it really changes from being a trilogy about Luke Skywalker, him becoming the hero, into a trilogy about Darth Vader getting redemption, right? Like Anakin
Hmm.
Skywalker getting redemption in many ways. So that's kind of a cool thing in which you don't need to be, you're not chiseling your story into stone, right? That it'll never change. It should always be kind of flowing, and you should always be open to other ideas until sort of like the last possible minute where it needs to be committed to, language or, whatever you're
Hmm.
going to submit it or whatever. But yeah, for the most part, I'd say keeping it open. And another thing too that you had mentioned before is that I really always encourage my students not to have their characters die in the end. That was something that I always would do when I was starting out. Like, oh, I'm going to be this edgy guy, and it's like the characters always die. I'm like, no, keep them alive and just make them miserable. That's way worse, right? And it's like, if they have this problem on a Wednesday, then you got to think, the story happens on Wednesday. Well, what happens on Thursday, right?
Yeah.
If the town is wiped out and they no longer have any friends and, whatever, well, they just don't stop existing. They're going to keep existing. And I want to know what that story is. And you should be able to tell me that story and then tell me what happens in a week, and then just kind of thinking about the natural progression of, our lives. We experience things and then we tell stories to recapture those events. And storytelling, I mean, obviously that's just what we're doing, and we're trying to pick out the best parts. But yeah, not thinking about it like a snow globe, in which the snow globe, everything is encapsulated within the snow globe, and that's not the way that we actually live, right? There's all sorts of
Hmm.
messiness, and we never really kind of know. We've got all the plans that you've made, and then your stock portfolio crashes, or your car gets stolen, or something like that, and all of your plans suddenly change that you didn't have any intention. You didn't think your day was going to go that way, and then all of a sudden things change. And that's where I want to see more of that kind of unpredictability in student stories as well. And then, like you were saying, the whole character plus setting equals the plot is okay. Well, the car got stolen, and they were supposed to go to Europe tomorrow for vacation. What do? They got to make a choice. Are they going to
Hmm.
stay, or are they going to go on their trip, right? And each one of those choices tells you a little bit more about that character, right? So maybe it's their
Hmm.
honeymoon, right? Like that's a much bit. They're like, oh, I'm not going on the honeymoon because I got to get my Porsche back, right? And it's like, oh, well, the husband isn't too cool with that because he's like, honey, leave the Porsche. We got this honeymoon in Italy to go to. So that would be one way in which, again, you would judge that character based on the choices that they would make.
Do you ask the students when you're doing this to constrain certain aspects of their conversation about it? For instance, the tone. Like,
Hmm.
is this going to be a funny story? Is this going to be a tragedy? Is it more of a let's just see the facts of the matter as they play out, and then we'll go back and decide whether this is going to be funny or sad or
Yeah.
scary? Or like, how do you think about that sort of? I mean, it's not even really genre. It really is just sort of
Right.
the tone or tenor of the story you're
Thematic
telling.
tone, and that's where too, like, I always tell them to hold off on theme as well, to like, let's just get an interesting character, put him in a vice, you know what I mean, and screw it a couple times so they get some pressure on them, see what they do, and then decide, right? And this is where this goes
Mhm.
back to the idea of scope, because this is something working with a lot of game design students, but students of every kind of media, they overscope immediately. Like their initial scope is
Mhm.
always 2 to 3 times larger than what they can actually accomplish in the space and the time that they're given, which is why I'm very prescriptive about we're going to tell a very specific kind of story, 3 act structure, act one, scene one, and then the, climax happens 3 scenes later. Every
Mhm.
scene needs to build on the tensions, right? And that's another thing that they often will have problems with is things happen, but tension doesn't escalate. And that's a key part of the second act is that your scenes
Mhm.
need to, things need to get more difficult, more challenging. The stakes need to go up, other problems happen or whatever.
Mhm.
And it's not just things happen. And this is where I was just saying, if you have to deliver some information, well, have one person say they should go left and the other person, 2 characters. Your protagonist wants to go left and the person they're with wants to go right. You know what I mean? Like that's a tension right
Mhm.
there. It's not like world shattering, but and then they argue about it, right? And it's like, okay, well, you just took a simple decision, we're going to go left, and you complicated it, and now it's like, oh, are they going to be angry, are they going to leave, whatever, we
Mhm.
not, are we going to continue to fight about this or whatever. So it's all of those little things that I think as you start layering it on, they start to come out a little bit more. And then that's
Mhm.
when, especially if something isn't quite falling into place, I usually just kind of encourage them, just kind of keep working at it, and hopefully something shakes out. And then it's like, Darth Vader is his dad, right? You know, and
Yeah.
then you have that moment when they're doing this collaboratively too. It's like all ideas on the table all the time, right? And then start eliminating things once you start seeing the things that are working well and people get excited about. But I'm very much about. I mean, the big thing that I'm always fighting against are students who come in and they've been working on a world building project for 12 years, and they're going to
Yeah.
tell this story about this character, and they're obsessing about it. And I'm like, okay, I'm totally excited for you to do that after this class, right? In this class, what we're going to do is look at lots and lots and lots of different permutations and problems and different types of people and whatever. So then when you go finish your magnum opus, you will do it having thought about all of these things, right? Because it's like I'd much rather have them generate a lot of new ideas and start to get a sense for what works and what doesn't work for good storytelling, rather than having them obsess about I am going to write this best-selling novel and then go on to worldwide fame, which is what most of them think they're going to do.
There's a real strong parallel here to, we haven't talked at all about this. I'm kind of surprised, but for all the times we've mentioned Game of Thrones, we haven't discussed the problems with the latter half of that
Oh,
HBO
right.
series,
Yeah.
not
Actually,
leaving aside all the problems with the text not being written, although at this point I am happier to sort of fill in
yeah.
the gaps myself. But with respect to the HBO series specifically, the decision by Benioff and Weiss, the two showrunners for it, to leave the show, like that, and for any of you who weren't aware of this, there was a plan for there to be about 11 seasons of Game of Thrones initially. It was going to tell the entire story from beginning to end in the way that George R. R. Martin intended for it to be told. Benioff and Weiss wanted to leave the project so they could go do other stuff. And at the time, I think they either had a project that was lined up for Netflix or Disney, something along those lines. They thought they were going to do Star Wars. And so they basically shrugged and said, like, we're done. We just need to get to the end. And so the entire latter half of the series became predetermined and characters just start doing stuff. So by the time you get to season 6 or so, the decisions of the characters become less and less rational. Rational may not even be the right word because some of them are irrational, but they become less determined by the environmental pressure applied to
Yeah.
those characters and more the characters have to make this decision so they can get to the right place to get to the climax to get this over with.
Yeah.
And I'm not bringing this up because I think it's valuable to deconstruct what decisions specifically in that show were good or bad, but I do think the overdetermined nature of what those characters were going to do in service of continuing the plot was super problematic.
Yeah.
And I can appreciate the fact that you would have to like pull the reins on some students to keep them from doing the same thing because they had decided, I want this character to succeed at this specific thing, and I'm going to
Yeah.
make sure they get there. And I mean,
Right.
I was also thinking about Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul, which we've discussed previously, but one of the reasons why I'm so impressed by Vince Gilligan and Peter Gould for being able to pull off what they did is they took a self-contained story in this specific story world, told it from beginning to end,
Yeah.
it had a climax, it had tension, it had a denouement, and then they went back and basically bookended it with Better Call Saul by writing the entire prequel to what happened in Breaking Bad, and then what happened after Breaking Bad
Yeah.
ends with the death of Walter White. Spoiler, sorry I ruined that for all of
Yeah.
you listening.
Yeah.
But it's very similar actually to the story of Star Wars going from being about Luke Skywalker to being about the tragedy and then redemption of Anakin Skywalker. Better Call Saul essentially turns Breaking Bad from being about the rise and fall of Walter White to being about the rise, fall, and redemption of Saul Goodman, right?
Yeah.
And I think that to me speaks to really thoughtful storytelling where you aren't so worried about getting to that singular plot
Yeah.
outcome
Yeah.
and more about, okay, so in the story of Breaking Bad, we see what happens with Walter White and his downfall. That's not the beginning and end of time. Like time
Right.
existed before Walter White, time will continue to exist after Walter White. How is everyone else around him who is a victim or inheritor of this world he's created, how are they reacting to the things that he did and the perspective change from Walter White to Jimmy McGill slash Saul Goodman, as well as all the other people who are kind of peripheral characters in that universe? Getting to see what happened through their eyes changes the dynamic of the original series in ways that
absolutely.
you can't watch it the same way after you've seen Better Call Saul because now you're hyper aware of these various things that were out of your perspective, your point
Right.
of view when you initially watched Breaking Bad. And it's not just true for us as the audience, but it's true of the creators. Like
Yeah,
they're now
exactly.
going back and looking at this differently, and you can't unsee the
Yeah.
things you've now seen.
But
And
it's also the Andor and Rogue One
yeah, yeah,
situation, right?
yeah.
Like it's really hard to watch. And people say now, oh well, it's great that Han, Chewbacca, and Luke get the gold medal at the end of Star Wars, right? But it's like, but what about Cassian? And like
Yeah.
no one even knows who these people. Like no one in the galaxy knows who these people are. So I love it. But I actually jotted down Game of Thrones episode because Game of Thrones is so fascinating in terms of the initial plan for the novels and then how that got
Mhm.
changed and then how you have these guys who they've never done a project that is a transmedia adaptation
Mhm.
of, and then it's going great to begin with and then it sort of goes off the rails. I mean, in terms of, and then also just with the world building, like I can't remember whether we talked about it earlier in one of the other episodes now because I'm also not remembering, but it is absolutely a case of there's the world of the North and there's the world of King's
Mhm.
Landing, and the story is one of Ned Stark being badly out of his element and playing the Game of Thrones by the rules that he thinks apply rather than
Mhm.
the rules that apply in King's Landing to disastrous effect, right? That's
Mhm.
it's very much. I mean, it's one of the reasons why I do come back to it so often is because it really is a story. The Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones specifically is about the world building and character development and how you gotta appreciate when you move from one world to another that you need to adjust. And Ned Stark isn't capable of doing that and does not have a good end. So
There's an interesting real life corollary here where the contemporary politics we're all now swimming through has all of these characters and
yeah,
tensions and characteristics. And so when I would talk to my students about their own collaborative world building and storytelling, I think I did this a little bit differently than you in terms of how I ran my interactive storytelling class. But in general, every year or every section of this course I ran, we would pick a new story world to kind of dive into. Most of them were existing ones because it was easier for the students, especially in such a compressed timeline, to be able to grab onto
sure.
what that world was all about. So, for example, we did one that was Middle Earth, and it was right after the events of Lord of the Rings. So we're about to enter or are entering the fourth age, which isn't written, right? Tolkien didn't write the fourth age. So we have the liberty of being able to fill in the characters and whatever happens to them in that timeline, but we also benefit from knowing what other characters have existed, what lessons were learned, and we really tried to address that question that George R. R. Martin had asked, which is what happens the day after the coronation, right?
Yeah, yeah.
How does Aragorn reign as a king? And that led these students to then interrogate what are the important themes about Lord of the Rings, and
Hmm.
then how do we turn these into interesting new themes that really say something about the time we're living in or
Yeah,
something about the
exactly.
world as
Yeah.
we see it. And I'm looking at the three characters we've created, and as you mentioned, like it's very easy to see the corollary being AI, or I guess you could even broaden the scope a little bit more than that and just say this is a story about how different people perceive the threat or promise of technology, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
we really emphasize that a lot in parts one and two. This idea of technology as the trending category being sort of the focal point of what's causing the tension to ramp up. That's the vice we're turning to basically say something's going to snap in this world.
Yeah.
And now we're visualizing that snap through these three characters as they relate to one another. So,
Yep. Yep. But so, one of the things too that we talked about in previous episodes is the speed at which things are trending. And this is where, so in our world, government presence is trending up. So it's 5 and it's going up. Economic strength is trending up from a 2. Wealth distribution is trending down from a 3, and technology is trending up from a 2. So it seems like it's not that I'm thinking about this as the world was stable until Tuesday. And Tuesday is when the messenger comes back saying,
mhm,
hey, I found this thing. We're now going, instead of us being slime farmers or whatever it is, right, that we're out here in the middle of this, dank swamp or whatever, forget the people who are sending a once a year truck to go bring all of our slime back. Now we're going to make it big. We don't need them
mhm.
anymore. And then immediately the people who are like, okay, well, let's monetize this, let's do it, right, are going to be at odds with the people. And it's also, if everyone's poor, you don't have to worry about wealth distribution so much, right? Everyone gets one can of beans every Tuesday, and you got to be happy with that. It's like, okay, well, wait a minute. Now there's real wealth flooding in here, and if you don't want it, then you don't get it. You know what I mean? Like if you don't want
Mhm.
to, if you don't want to do this, then we'll, I'll take your share then, which is a very pro-capitalist way, right? It's like the teachers all say, well, I don't care about making tons of money. And it's like, oh, good. So then you can work for no wages whatsoever, right? Because you love doing what you're
Mhm.
doing. I love money, so I could totally see that sort of playing through. And I think that's where it seems like it's already falling into place, right? Is that this
Right,
is,
yeah.
it's the merchant is home making a souffle, and the messenger kicks the door down and says, "Honey, we're going to be billionaires," right? And it's like, what are you talking about? And then it would go from there. That's the way I would see Act One, Scene One happening. Is that what you kind of are thinking too?
Yes, pretty much. And although I haven't defined the rest of these scenes for myself, one of the things I'm imagining is if you did like a flashback or you look at the scene where the messenger discovers this thing, maybe the reason we talked a little bit last time about what the thing could be or what it's doing, right? And we talked
Yep.
about how it amplifies everybody's core values, core
Core
personality
traits.
traits.
Yep.
I'm kind of wondering if this is like an Oracle at Delphi situation where the messenger is fisherman, somebody that's gone out to go farm the slime, whatever they're doing. They get to this island, they go into the cave to explore it a little bit, they do some spelunking. They find this obelisk or this large stone that's sticking out of the ground, and they have a vision, right? It gives them the ability of what they think is foresight or some other form of traversing space and time to make
Hmm.
sense of the world. They go back to the merchant. They start talking about how I'm the fisher person. I'm going to start leading people over there. We could make a killing by being the people who sort of monopolize the ability to traverse this lake that's very big and
Yeah.
dangerous.
I was thinking about underwater spelunking because I find it totally horrifying. So I was thinking that could be like making it real difficult to get to this, whatever
Yes,
this thing
I
is.
think that's a great framework for this just because it's going to be so rare that somebody's willing to make that journey. But if
Yeah.
they do, there's this possibility that they can see through time and be able
Yep.
to figure these things out. And I'm kind of wondering if maybe at some point the merchant, as the person being torn both ways, maybe the conclusion of this is trying to figure out how to split the difference to get this obelisk, this thing out of the ground. They lead a mining party in there and disaster strikes where
Hmm.
they try to start digging it out. And this sheer act of hammering the walls around where the obelisk is causes there to be some sort of massive eruption, fire, explosion, or something that's then read as an omen that this thing is supernatural, that it's dangerous, that we have meddled with forces beyond our imagining. And
Hmm.
in reality, the obelisk is just sitting on top of a gas vein.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
striking the wall caused a spark that blew up the natural
Yeah.
gas that had filled the chamber, and that everybody's having these hallucinations because
Yeah.
they're high on natural gas fumes,
That's
right?
yeah.
So I'm kind of thinking like that also in its own way works as a metaphor for what AI is, that
Yeah.
people are
Exactly. Exactly.
attributing this personality or actual, general intelligence to this
Yeah.
thing that's just a large language model. It's just, for all intents and purposes, it's just a parrot that spits out whatever it's been told to spit out. And the healer, being the only person with foresight, is perhaps the one who is they feel a sense of shame and loss because they end up losing people they care about as a result of their greed, their desire to go down and turn this thing into some financial gain. So it's a Pyrrhic victory for the healer. They were right, but at what cost,
At what
right?
cost? Yeah. Well, that's what I was thinking too. I mean, as always, I'm thinking a lot of things as you're talking. So one would be, well, if you're writing a novel, chapter one is told from the messenger's perspective about how you can't go underwater spelunking; it's too dangerous. And they say, well, I'm going to do it anyway, right? And the climax
Mm,
is them finding the obelisk, right? That's their story, and then they run home, and then the next story is told from the merchant's point of view, with the messenger kicking the door open and saying, I found this thing, we're going to be rich, and having the messenger or having the merchant be less than ecstatic about it, right? But this is
mhm.
where too, like, so the merchant's primary characteristic is being versatile. They're positive one, and this is where I'm not going to be able to think of it right now. But this would be if I were to, take a long shower, take a long walk with the dog or something like that. Like, how would this character be able to then sort of square the circle between the two poles,
Mm.
right? Like to rectify or to make the situation workable, sort of somehow. But that's where, I would think just running through, like if I were to have to do this in 5 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever, the opening scene is the merchant having the messenger kick it down the door saying we're going to get rich. The next scene is the merchant going to see the healer, and the healer says, That's not great. Like this has red flags all over it, right? Third scene is going back the next day or a couple days later, and the messenger is even more charming and grumpier than ever, right? And it's like, wait a minute, this is going bad. And then maybe other people are starting to become attracted to the messenger and the messenger's story, right? So then, the next scene with them going back, and maybe that's where there's a confrontation between the healer, the messenger, and the merchant, all at the
Mm.
climax. And that's where the merchant would need to decide, am I going to take the side of the healer or am I going to take the side of the messenger, right? And that would be, the question would be, Act 1, Scene 1, is the merchant going to go the route of the messenger, or are they going to hold to their principles, right? And then the answer is, oh, I don't know right now, right? Like maybe I'll flip a coin. Tails, they go with the they decide to break up with the messenger and they go with the healer, right? Like that's it. Then it's like, okay, well then how do they feel about that? Because that is sort of like a no-win situation for them to be in, which I always love for stories as well, right? It's like you're taking the least good option, or you're not even sure which option is the least good, but you got to make one, right? So that would be one very fast way of being like, oh, there is a five-scene, three-act story that follows classic Aristotelian plot structure, right? Resolves. It may not be the best thing in the world, but we had nothing when we sat down, right? And now we've got, it's like whatever. Last week we didn't have a world. Now we got a world. Now we got three characters, and now we got a plot, right? At least one plot. And then it's like, okay, well, could you tell that story from the healer's perspective, where the story
Hmm.
begins with the merchant walking into the healer's grove of healing or whatever, being like, I got news, like I don't know if I can work with you anymore, or be your student anymore. So then and then it's like, oh well, then the question is, does the healer keep their student, or do they lose the student to the evils of the messenger Sam Altman?
It's funny you circle back to Sam Altman because I thought, oh, the merchant is versatile. They probably have a perspective that's going to try to compromise between the two poles that they're being pulled towards to see whether or not they can convince their lover and their teacher that they're not so far apart that this is irreconcilable. And the first thing I thought of is, okay, so if the messenger is the Sam Altman of this story, the healer is going to be sort of the technology philosopher, the philosopher of technology. The merchant is probably going to be somebody who thinks, okay, well, maybe we need to tame this force in order to keep it from falling into the wrong hands. Like,
Right, right,
it's
right.
not all bad that we found this, but I understand your reservation, and I think we could be the ones to protect society from it. Whereas the healer is just the I'm not getting involved. This is
Yeah,
some serious bullshit, and I don't
yeah,
want to be pulled apart by whatever this crazy thing
yep,
is that you're getting involved in. Which is like the equivalent of you get the Sam Altman who's like all gung ho, we're going to do the AI no matter what. You
right.
get the middle merchant who's going to be the well, we should develop the AI so that the bad guys don't develop the AI. Let it become an evil force. We need to keep it from becoming Skynet, so we have to control it. And
Yep.
then the healer is the person of maybe we shouldn't make the AI at all because this seems like a really bad idea.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
I was thinking too. Another cool sort of riff on this would be if the messenger went down underwater, came back up with a ring, and the ring made him really grumpy. And then a guy from another kingdom says, "Let's use the ring and the power of the ring to defeat the Dark Lord." And an old wizard says, "No, you should just destroy it." And then the question is, what does the merchant do? I think that is a story that could really work.
I bet that would be super popular
Yeah,
if we were to find a way to put
exactly.
that together.
I don't think
Do you,
it doesn't have legs. I forget it.
surely would not be able to make a bunch of movies out of that. I
Right.
don't think
Stop
anyway.
calling me Shirley. Right.
I'm kind of curious, actually, now that you've brought that up, to what extent do you find students falling into these tropes and just sort of building on the existing
Oh,
stories they're familiar with?
a
Like,
hundred percent.
and
A hundred
and how do
percent.
you get them to not do that? Like, what is
Right.
the antidote to that very obvious thing? I mean, even last time when we were talking about what does this world look like, we were invoking all of these examples of things it reminds us of, things that we would draw on. Is this just a situation where time is a flat circle, all stories are retold forever? There's no unique story to be told because we've done them all before. Like, how do you think about that?
Yeah, that's what I mean. Because one of the things too, there's a book that's called Master Plots. There's an older book called Plotto, in which this guy was great back. It's back in the 20s, I think it was. He's trying to like create an engine that could model every single possible plot. It's a great Plotto, Plotto. I recommend it for everyone because it's sort of like this weird manic, work of this guy or whatever. But it's so it's like, oh well, you've got like one of the master plots I think is like rags to riches, right? And it's like, okay, well, you can tell. This is where I think, like, when we're talking about how do you interpret what a messenger is, what do you interpret what a merchant is, right? You can tell the, Annie rags to riches story identical to that, which is what students I think often do, as opposed to thinking more broadly about how could we interpret rags and how could we interpret riches, right? So could it be that it's not, not monetary, but it's like, some other kind of spiritual or some other kind of growth or something like that. But yeah, that's one of the things too that I was talking with a narrative designer from Obsidian last week who happened to be on campus, and she was saying these people who want to be game writers, they need to read more. They need to read more history. They need to learn more philosophy. They need more literature. They need more movies. They need more, classy TV and stuff like that. Because she's like, they know everything about video games, but video games don't have the last word on good stories, right? They don't even have the first word on good stories.
I was going to say, I think that categorically, that is not the place where I would recommend going to look. But on the other hand, though, I think this is something that I would probably say to my students. Maybe not in terms of narrative design, but the way that games or the game designers have been able to synthesize different genres in different ways with different organization and aesthetics. I think that's a really useful example for them to be able to understand. You're just remixing, right? Like you're taking all these things, putting them into the soup and figuring out what can I pull out that's going to be meaningful or interesting. And I think about this a lot because of the fact that, there's only... for every story I've read or watched, seen, played, whatever, there's only so many permutations you can do before you're going back to the well on the same thing. And then the question is just, what are you doing that's a little bit different about this particular twist? What is the twist you're putting on this that's going to make it a little bit different or interesting? Or did you just find interesting characters at these specific intersections of the social forces in your world, that even if the story, the plot has been played out in some other format before, did you find something about that tension that was gripping, engaging, that made me relate to these characters in a way that I haven't related to characters, or just differently, that are related to them differently than I have in other works of fiction or works in nonfiction too.
But thinking about, that's the way the Coen brothers, I believe, make their movies, right? Is they don't they don't plot, they just kind of make these goofy characters in weird places, wind them up and watch them go, right? Which I think is it's not the way that I tend to work, but I think it's kind of cool.
One of the reasons why I love Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? And I mean, based on the way they have talked about that movie, it wasn't explicitly made initially to just retell the Odyssey. Yeah. But in practice, that's essentially what happens. And I think that's why you see that they started to lean into that a couple of points in the movie. That they probably, I'm speculating here, I don't know this for sure, but I'm guessing what happened is they came up with an idea for a story they wanted to tell, started to identify some things that were like, oh, this is kind of like Odysseus traveling home. Right. And then decided, oh, well, what if we make the Bible salesman a literal cyclops because he's missing an eye? And what if we have the sirens that are going to go and, draw them off the path of where they were initially headed or whatever? Like, I kind of imagine that's what I would encourage my students to do if they were doing this and gravitating too close to another thing. Or if I recognized, like, hey, this sounds a lot like X or like Y. What do you like or not like about that when you look at it? What would you do a little bit differently? Yeah, exactly.
As I was going to say, too, like, and this is another spoiler for those of you who are Star Wars fans, but I was complaining loudly to my students the other day that the question that the Book of Boba Fett asked is, how can we get Boba Fett riding a Rancor around Tatooine, right? I mean, like that was the question that whole show was built to answer. And it's like, it's not a very interesting question, right? And it's like, that's why, and there's other parts of it. That's another one that we could probably talk about, sort of Star Wars media. And that, so what's happening so often now, too, with different kinds of media is that the creators they don't have time to write the story. It's like, congratulations, you're now going to be making Book of Boba Fett. Filming starts Monday. You're like, what? Monday? Like, I don't even have a script, right? So they're writing the script while they're filming it. And that's where you get lots of, bad flashbacks and things are told out of order because they're just trying to figure out. They started filming and then they got to try and make a story out of it. So.
It's funny you mentioned that because I had shared with you earlier today that Onion article that was titled "Disney Promises Star Wars Fans a New Era of Blind Stabs at What They Seemed to Like Before," which is exactly what the sequel trilogy is.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where, that's somebody had said too, that one of my students was saying that they really didn't like Star Wars Rebels, which of course he's wrong about. But he's like, oh, it's just cameos. That's all it is. It's the cameo show. And I'm like, well, you should watch it a little bit more closely because I think there's a lot of great stuff going on in Rebels. But yeah, that's where it does feel that way with Star Wars a lot of the time. It's like, ooh, as soon as you have a force wielder, or as soon as you have a lightsaber or whatever it is, it's gonna be cool. And it's like it doesn't work. Stories don't work that way, right? I mean, like that's how lame stories work. And we didn't know what a lightsaber was when we first started watching Star Wars. It's through watching it that you find those things to be cool. It's not that the thing was cool and made the movie cool. It's like, well, the story and the characters made those, kind of tropes now. They're the ones who made it cool, right? I've said too that no one cared about Tolkien's. I mean, Tolkien had the Silmarillion, big chunks of that written, and no one wanted to touch that with a 10-foot pole because they wanted to hear about the Hobbit. Right, I mean, like the Hobbit was it's not this grand biblical scale that the Silmarillion is. Even though I love the Silmarillion, it's like, oh well, there's this funny little frumpy Hobbit. What's he doing? Like why is he being called out into the?
You might even
world?
say that he's charming and grumpy.
He's charming and grumpy. He's not trying to gain promotion though.
He was kind of poor at the beginning.
He was
relative to how much he ended up with at the end.
That's very true. That's very true.
So as we're kind of wrapping up here, I'm thinking, what would be the next step? Like if you had your students doing this, because I know this was the third in our third part series, I want to leave the audience with something they could do. So if they were doing this with their own learners,
yep,
what would you recommend that they do after this character creation process? Is it just immediately let's jump into fleshing out the story and then revise, or like what would that look like in a classroom?
What I typically do, and I mean I'm teaching mostly fiction classes, would be what would be the problem that this character would have, or what would be the most interesting problem that this character or characters would have, and then frame that as a question, and then how would we answer that question, right? And then think about, I mean, we were just doing this in my class the other day, is I asked them to do that, and then I'm like, okay, now what would make the problem worse? What would make things more difficult? And they're like, oh, well, maybe this would happen. I'm like, okay, so maybe that happens in Act 2, Scene 2. That just made the problem worse. What would make it even worse? You know what I mean? And this is where if you don't know a lot about your characters, it's hard to, develop that stuff. But if you know a lot about the world and you know about the character, like their relationships, or whatever, it's like, oh, I always use the one, you're leaving for your big job interview and someone the sheriff calls and says your brother's in the drunk tank again. If you don't get him, he's going to go away to the big house or whatever. So then you got to decide, what are you going to do? It's like that was not anything that you thought about as a character, right? But now you got to make a decision, and it made the decision tough. Are you going to go take this big interview, or are you going to go help your good for nothing brother? So that's kind of what I would do. And I mean, I also like to look into, I mean, this is more from the narrative sort of perspective, but thinking about where would this story take place? Where would be the most interesting place for it to start? And then getting into like the for creatives, getting into the 5 senses, what that place would look like, smell like, feel like, what time of year is it? What temperature is it? What, who else is around? Where is the immediate tension? What are the other points of tension? So really just kind of exploding all of that. And this is where, I mean, I guess this would be the last thing I would say on it is there is intentionality on my part to overproduce across the board. Create more characters than you need, create more, settings, whatever, and then figure out, where is the best story in all of that stuff, and just tell that story. Like you don't need to tell about hundreds of years of history and whatever. You need to tell the story about how Marion got to, decide that she's going to leave her lover because he's gone mad from, AI or whatever, right? Like that's the story, and the world needs to make enough sense that all of those pieces seem to fit. And it's fun. And I mean, it's one of those things where it's like, again, it's that idea of if you build an entire world, I don't want you to have a story that comes out of it. I want you to have dozens, hundreds of stories that come out of it, right? Like it should, lots of different people in lots of different situations should have lots of different stories. And that's just the way too that I think people need to look at their own lives, right? And looking around and it's like, oh, everyone's following their own story, and we all have opinions about whether whether they're doing it right or wrong or what they value or whatever. And this is just a way of trying to capture it in an artistic format, in a storytelling format, to say something about what it's like to be a human being and what it's like to live in our world.
As one final thought, I'm thinking about this as an instructional designer, and it may be that some of you listening are doing jobs where you're like, I don't know, this doesn't really fit what I'm doing. My students aren't going to be creative writers. The reason why I think this is still valuable is because it is cross-disciplinary. And if you start building out the characters, you start understanding the world they're a part of, you can tease out where you can get at some of those like capital T truth, big ideas related to your domain. Yeah. So if you were teaching a course about chemistry or physics or history or English, there are so many places you could start picking at this world that's been created and the characters that have been developed for it to start asking, okay, how does this relate to my target learning objective? And when you go back to that question at the beginning of your story, the question being posed at the beginning of your story, if you've aligned that with your learning objective, then the students producing the story really becomes about them teaching somebody else about this thing you want them to learn. And I know that sounds really complicated. I mean, it's one of the reasons we wrote this book, is to try and help people figure out how to do that. So see chapter 3, Theory to Practice, if you're interested. But the idea is finding those things within the body of these outlines you've created. And I would actually include the wiki entries as well, like that you start piecing together, where does all this stuff fit together? And then for the edification of your students, asking them to research, to think about where the commonalities exist between the characters, the world, and the thing that the course is all about, or that the whatever it is you're teaching is all about. And then getting them to articulate, as they would to another person, why this matters, what you do about it, why we think this is the way things should be or could be, and then using that teaching opportunity, that opportunity to tell the story as a teachable moment for their audience, not just you as the instructor getting them to recognize through the writing process that, this is how to tell a good story. Like, I think these two things marry to one another quite nicely.
Yeah, I think, just to add on to that just a little bit, that whole idea that stories are about characters making choices to overcome obstacles. And that's what we do every day. And a lot of those choices are really mundane. But it's also like, oh, well, what are you going to do if you're in a situation at work and your boss asks you to do something unethical? Or I'm thinking about Tori's from the book. She was doing how does an inkjet printer sort of, how does the science of that work? But, built it around the idea of being in Splatoon world, where this is going to be a weapon, right? And it's like, what are our ethical obligations? Not just can the science do it, but ought we be making this, right? And it's a way of being able to, like, you get to bring in ethics and questions like that into a class that's otherwise about, science and engineering. So.
Well, we did it. We made it to the end of the 3rd episode in our 3-part series. How do you feel?
I love it. And this is why I often feel energized. Like, I want to go write this story now. Like, not to pat myself on the back, but I think it's, it's good stuff.
I bet it'd be more widely read than the actual book that this podcast is based on.
That's not hard. So.
That's why we love you all, because you're here with us in this little community of a dozen people. And
you're looking back, the year is 2100 and we're all long gone, but this is a relic from the past. So.
But they've turned us into AI, and that's how we persist.
That's right. Exactly. And AI turned out to be the solution to everything after all.
Sam Altman was right. We should have listened to him when he kicked down the door.
All right.
Well, thanks, folks, for listening in, and we'll be back at you with something new next time.
Yep. Awesome. Thanks so much. It was fun.
All right. See you later.
Yep.
The Worldbuilding Workshop podcast is a production of Trent Hergenrader and Steven Slota. Our theme song, Stompin' at Midnight, is a copyright-free Creative Commons production created by composer Kevin MacLeod. The show is mixed and edited by Steven Slota. The companion text, The Worldbuilding Workshop, Teaching Critical Thinking and Empathy Through World Modeling, Simulation, and Play, is published by the MIT Press, copyright 2025. Print copies can be purchased through the MIT Press website. The audiobook version, narrated by Steven Slota, is available at www.theworldbuildingworkshop.com.